Chatterjee has argued that nationalism can be both a liberating force and a problem depending on the context and how it is deployed. He critiques the dominant narrative of nationalism, particularly in the context of post-colonial societies, and raises concerns about its potential exclusionary nature and its impact on marginalized communities. According to Chatterjee, nationalism often constructs an imagined community, based on a shared cultural or historical identity, creating a sense of belonging among its members. However, this construction of national identity can lead to the exclusion of certain groups, such as ethnic, religious, or linguistic minorities, who may not fit into the dominant narrative. Chatterjee emphasizes the importance of recognizing and accommodating diverse identities within the nation-state framework. Another problem highlighted by Chatterjee is the unequal distribution of power within nationalist movements. He argues that nationalist struggles are often led by a dominant elite who claim to represent the entire nation, but in reality, they may prioritize their own interests over those of the marginalized sections of society. This can result in the perpetuation of existing social hierarchies and inequalities. Furthermore, Chatterjee points out that nationalism often relies on the idea of a homogeneous national culture, which can marginalize and suppress subaltern or minority cultures. He advocates for recognizing and preserving the cultural diversity within a nation, rather than imposing a singular national culture. Chatterjee's critique of nationalism is rooted in his understanding of post-colonial societies, where the struggle for independence often gave rise to nationalist movements. He argues for a more inclusive and pluralistic form of nationalism that respects the rights and identities of all citizens, rather than reinforcing dominant power structures and excluding marginalized communities. It's worth noting that Chatterjee's views on nationalism are part of a broader academic discourse and are subject to debate and interpretation. Different scholars may have different perspectives on the issue, and the understanding of nationalism varies across different historical, social, and cultural contexts. Here are some key points regarding Partha Chatterjee's critique of nationalism, along with examples. Exclusionary nature of nationalism. Chatterjee highlights how nationalism can be exclusionary, particularly towards minority groups that do not fit into the dominant narrative of the nation. For example, in India, the rise of Hindu nationalism has raised concerns about the marginalization of religious minorities, such as Muslims and Christians, who may feel excluded from the vision of a Hindu-majority nation. Unequal distribution of power. Chatterjee argues that nationalist movements often prioritize the interests of the dominant elite, leading to the perpetuation of social hierarchies. A prominent example is the Indian nationalist movement during the colonial era, where leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru played crucial roles. While they fought for independence, their leadership positions reinforced existing class and caste hierarchies, limiting the representation and agency of marginalized sections of society. Homogenization of national culture. Chatterjee criticizes the tendency of nationalism to impose a homogeneous national culture, which can marginalize subaltern or minority cultures. For instance, the language policies in many post-colonial countries often prioritize a single official language, which may disadvantage linguistic minority communities and their cultural expressions. Cultural diversity and pluralism. Chatterjee advocates for recognizing and preserving cultural diversity within the nation. One example is the debate around regional autonomy and recognition of diverse linguistic and cultural identities in India. Movements such as the demand for a separate state of Telangana or the recognition of indigenous cultures in northeastern India reflect the struggle for accommodating different cultural expressions within the nation-state framework. Liberation potential. While critical of nationalism, Chatterjee also acknowledges its potential as a liberating force. Nationalist movements have historically played a significant role in decolonization struggles, empowering marginalized communities to fight for their rights and self-determination. For instance, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa under the leadership of figures like Nelson Mandela was a nationalist struggle that challenged racial oppression and segregation. It's important to note that these examples are provided to illustrate Chatterjee's general critique of nationalism. However, the complexities of nationalism and its manifestations vary across different contexts and historical periods. Colonial legacy. Chatterjee emphasizes that nationalism in post-colonial societies is often influenced by the colonial experience. He argues that the struggle against colonial rule can shape nationalist movements and their understanding of identity and sovereignty. An example is the impact of British colonial rule in India, which led to the emergence of anti-colonial nationalism and the demand for independence. Subaltern counter-narratives. Chatterjee highlights the importance of recognizing subaltern counter-narratives within nationalist movements. These narratives represent the perspectives and struggles of marginalized groups who challenge the dominant nationalist discourse. For instance, in the context of India, Dalit movements, which advocate for the rights of the lower castes, have questioned the upper caste dominance within the nationalist movement and have demanded social justice and equality. Globalization and nationalism. Chatterjee discusses the complexities of nationalism in the era of globalization. He argues that while globalization has eroded certain aspects of national sovereignty, it has also led to the resurgence of assertive and exclusionary forms of nationalism. An example can be seen in the rise of populist nationalist movements in various countries, such as the Brexit movement in the United Kingdom or the America First ideology in the United States. Gender and nationalism. Chatterjee explores the intersection of nationalism and gender, highlighting how nationalist movements often reinforce patriarchal norms and ideologies. For instance, women's rights movements within nationalist struggles may face resistance and patriarchal backlash. Chatterjee's work draws attention to the need for a gender-sensitive approach within nationalist movements and the inclusion of women's voices and concerns. Post-nationalism. While Chatterjee critiques nationalism, he also engages with the idea of post-nationalism. Post-nationalism suggests moving beyond narrow notions of exclusive national identities towards more cosmopolitan and inclusive frameworks. Chatterjee explores the potential for alternative forms of belonging and solidarity that transcend national boundaries while still addressing the concerns of justice, equality, and rights. State power and nationalism. Chatterjee examines the relationship between state power and nationalism, arguing that nationalism often reinforces and legitimizes the authority of the state. He raises concerns about the potential for authoritarian tendencies and the suppression of dissent in the name of nationalism. An example can be seen in the curbing of civil liberties and the rise of nationalist authoritarian regimes in certain countries, where dissent and criticism of the state are often deemed unpatriotic. Anti-imperialism and nationalism. Chatterjee explores the complex relationship between anti-imperialism and nationalism. While anti-imperialist struggles are often intertwined with nationalist movements, Chatterjee cautions against the dangers of reproducing imperialist structures and practices within the nationalist framework. He highlights the need to critically examine the ways in which nationalist movements can inadvertently perpetuate oppressive systems, even as they fight against external domination. Cultural hegemony and nationalism. Chatterjee draws attention to the role of cultural hegemony in shaping nationalist ideologies. He argues that dominant cultural narratives and symbols can be employed to create a sense of national identity, often excluding alternative perspectives. An example is the imposition of a singular national language or cultural norms that marginalize indigenous cultures or linguistic minorities within a nation-state. Transnationalism and nationalism. Chatterjee examines the tension between transnationalism and nationalism. He acknowledges the interconnectedness of the world and the movement of people, ideas, and capital across borders. Chatterjee questions whether nationalism, with its emphasis on bounded territorial identities, is compatible with the realities of transnational flows and challenges. Environmental concerns and nationalism. Chatterjee discusses the relationship between environmental issues and nationalism. He highlights how nationalist narratives sometimes prioritize economic development and national interests over environmental sustainability. This can result in the exploitation of natural resources, environmental degradation, and the displacement of local communities. Chatterjee calls for an approach that integrates ecological concerns within nationalist frameworks. Ethno-nationalism and identity politics. Chatterjee examines the role of ethno-nationalism and identity politics within nationalist movements. He criticizes the exclusionary tendencies of ethno-nationalism, which prioritize a particular ethnic or racial identity as the basis for national belonging. Chatterjee argues that this can lead to the marginalization and discrimination of minority groups within the nation. Examples include ethno-nationalist movements that have led to conflicts and tensions based on ethnic or religious divisions, such as the ethno-nationalist movements in the Balkans in the 1990s. Violence and nationalism. Chatterjee raises concerns about the potential for violence associated with nationalist movements. He discusses how the construction of the other and the sense of national identity can fuel hostility and conflict between different groups. Examples can be seen in historical instances of violent nationalism, such as the ethnic cleansing during the partition of India and the creation of Pakistan in 1947, where communal violence erupted between Hindus and Muslims. Global capitalism and nationalism. Chatterjee explores the relationship between global capitalism and nationalist ideologies. He argues that nationalist movements can be influenced and shaped by global economic forces, with certain groups using nationalist rhetoric to protect their economic interests against perceived threats from global markets. Examples include protectionist economic policies and anti-globalization movements that aim to safeguard domestic industries and jobs, often invoking nationalist sentiments. Diaspora and nationalism. Chatterjee examines the role of diaspora communities in nationalist movements. He argues that diasporic communities often maintain strong ties to their homeland and contribute to nationalist struggles. However, he also highlights the complexities of diasporic nationalism, which can manifest in various ways and sometimes lead to conflicts with the host societies. Examples include nationalist movements among diaspora communities advocating for the rights and interests of their homeland, such as the Tamil diaspora's involvement in the Sri Lankan Civil War. Cosmopolitanism and nationalism. Chatterjee engages with the tension between cosmopolitanism and nationalism. He critiques the exclusive nature of nationalism, which can hinder the development of a cosmopolitan outlook that embraces diversity and promotes global solidarity. Chatterjee explores the possibility of reconciling the aspirations of nationalism with the values of cosmopolitanism, envisioning a more inclusive and globally aware form of nationalism. Historical legacies and nationalism. Chatterjee emphasizes the role of historical legacies in shaping nationalist ideologies and narratives. He argues that nationalist movements often draw upon historical events and myths to construct a sense of collective identity and justify their political goals. However, Chatterjee raises concerns about the selective interpretation of history, which can lead to the distortion or exclusion of certain narratives and marginalize alternative perspectives. Language politics and nationalism. Chatterjee examines the connection between language politics and nationalism. He highlights how language can become a site of contestation and power within nationalist movements. For instance, language policies that prioritize one dominant language can marginalize linguistic minorities and contribute to the suppression of their cultural and political rights. Media and nationalism. Chatterjee discusses the role of media in shaping nationalist discourses and identities. He examines how media representations and narratives contribute to the construction of a national imaginary and influence public perceptions. Chatterjee raises concerns about the potential for media to reinforce exclusionary or divisive nationalist ideologies and propagate stereotypes or prejudices. Intersectionality and nationalism. Chatterjee engages with the concept of intersectionality and its relevance to nationalist movements. He highlights the importance of recognizing and addressing intersecting forms of oppression and discrimination within nationalist struggles. This includes considerations of gender, caste, class, and other social dimensions that shape experiences of marginalization and privilege. Regional nationalism and statehood. Chatterjee explores regional nationalism and the demand for statehood within nationalist movements. He argues that regional aspirations for self-determination often emerge as a response to perceived neglect or marginalization by the central state. Examples include movements for statehood in various regions, such as Catalonia in Spain or Scotland in the United Kingdom, where regional nationalism challenges the unitary notion of the nation-state. Imagined communities and everyday nationalism. Chatterjee examines the concept of imagined communities and how nationalism operates at the level of everyday life. He argues that nationalist ideologies and symbols are embedded in social practices, rituals, and cultural expressions, shaping people's sense of belonging and national identity. Chatterjee emphasizes the need to critically examine the pervasive influence of everyday nationalism and its potential exclusionary effects. Education and nationalism. Chatterjee explores the role of education in shaping nationalist ideologies and identities. He highlights how the education system can be instrumental in promoting a particular version of national history, culture, and values, often excluding alternative narratives. Chatterjee raises concerns about the potential for indoctrination and the suppression of critical thinking within nationalist education systems. Global migration and nationalism. Chatterjee examines the impact of global migration on nationalist ideologies. He discusses how the movement of people across borders challenges traditional notions of national identity and belonging. Chatterjee argues that nationalist movements often respond to global migration by advocating for restrictive immigration policies and reinforcing exclusionary narratives of us versus them. Ecological nationalism. Chatterjee engages with the concept of ecological nationalism, which emphasizes the protection of the environment and natural resources as central to national identity and interests. He explores the tensions between ecological concerns and the potential for exclusionary practices within such nationalist frameworks. For example, ecological nationalism may prioritize the preservation of pristine landscapes but overlook the rights and needs of marginalized communities who rely on those resources. Cosmopolitan nationalism. Chatterjee discusses the possibility of cosmopolitan nationalism, which seeks to reconcile national identity with a global perspective. He argues for a form of nationalism that embraces diversity, promotes solidarity across borders, and addresses global challenges such as climate change and economic inequality. Chatterjee envisions a nationalism that recognizes interdependencies and fosters cooperation rather than isolation. Anti-nationalism and dissent. Chatterjee explores the role of anti-nationalism and dissent within nationalist movements. He argues that dissent is an essential aspect of democratic societies and can contribute to a more inclusive and accountable nationalism. Chatterjee emphasizes the importance of creating spaces for critical engagement and questioning of nationalist ideologies without facing accusations of being anti-national. Transgressive nationalism. Chatterjee discusses the idea of transgressive nationalism, which challenges the boundaries and norms of the nation-state. He explores movements and expressions of nationalism that go beyond traditional notions of territory, ethnicity, or language, such as queer nationalism or movements for the rights of indigenous peoples. Transgressive nationalism questions and subverts established nationalist frameworks, seeking to redefine the boundaries and inclusiveness of the nation. Nationalism and economic inequality. Chatterjee examines the relationship between nationalism and economic inequality. He argues that nationalist movements can sometimes neglect or exacerbate socio-economic disparities within the nation. For example, nationalist rhetoric may emphasize national pride and unity but fail to address issues of poverty, inequality, and social justice. Nationalism and identity construction. Chatterjee discusses how nationalism contributes to the construction and negotiation of individual and collective identities. He explores how national identities are shaped by historical narratives, cultural symbols, and social practices. Chatterjee raises questions about the role of nationalism in influencing individuals' sense of self and their relationship to others. Post-colonial nationalism. Chatterjee analyzes nationalism in post-colonial contexts and highlights its complexities. He argues that post-colonial nationalist movements often emerge as a response to colonial oppression and the struggle for self-determination. However, Chatterjee also critiques how post-colonial nationalism can replicate or reinforce colonial power structures, leading to internal hierarchies and exclusionary practices. Nationalism and secularism. Chatterjee explores the relationship between nationalism and secularism. He argues that nationalist movements can both embrace and challenge secular ideals, depending on the specific historical and political context. Chatterjee critiques instances where nationalist movements promote religious exclusivism or discriminate against religious minorities, undermining the principles of secularism. Non-Western nationalisms. Chatterjee offers insights into non-Western forms of nationalism and their distinctive features. He challenges the assumption that nationalism is solely a Western phenomenon, arguing that nationalist movements in various parts of the world have their own historical, cultural, and political contexts. Chatterjee highlights the need to understand and analyze non-Western nationalisms on their own terms. Global solidarity and nationalism. Chatterjee explores the tension between global solidarity and nationalist aspirations. He raises questions about whether nationalism can coexist with broader forms of global cooperation and solidarity, such as movements for human rights, environmental justice, or socio-economic equality. Chatterjee argues for a critical engagement with nationalist ideologies to ensure they do not undermine broader struggles for global justice. Nationalism and post-nationalism. Chatterjee engages with the concept of post-nationalism, which challenges the primacy of the nation-state as the central organizing principle. He examines the potential for alternative forms of political organization and affiliation beyond the nation-state, advocating for a reimagining of collective identities and loyalties that move beyond narrow nationalist frameworks. Imagining alternative futures. Chatterjee encourages the exploration of alternative visions and futures beyond nationalism. He argues for the need to imagine and construct new forms of political and social organization that go beyond the limitations and exclusions of nationalist ideologies. Chatterjee advocates for a creative and critical engagement with the possibilities of post-national and cosmopolitan futures. Gender and nationalism. Chatterjee examines the gendered dimensions of nationalism and the ways in which nationalist ideologies often reinforce patriarchal norms and power structures. He highlights how women's roles and contributions within nationalist movements are often marginalized or confined to supporting roles. Chatterjee raises concerns about the exclusion of women's perspectives and the need for feminist critiques of nationalism. Symbolism and performance of nationalism. Chatterjee discusses the role of symbolism and performative aspects in nationalist movements. He argues that nationalist ideologies often rely on visual symbols, rituals, and public displays to evoke a sense of national pride and unity. Chatterjee explores how these performative aspects can shape collective identities and reinforce exclusionary narratives. Nationalism and memory politics. Chatterjee analyzes the politics of memory within nationalist movements. He argues that the construction of historical memory is often instrumental in shaping national identity and reinforcing narratives of victimhood, heroism, or exceptionalism. Chatterjee raises questions about the selective and contested nature of memory politics and the potential for exclusion or distortion of historical truths. Nationalism and populism. Chatterjee examines the relationship between nationalism and populism. He argues that nationalist movements often tap into populist rhetoric and appeal to the emotions and grievances of the masses. Chatterjee raises concerns about the potential for populist nationalism to foster divisive and exclusionary politics that scapegoat marginalized groups or stoke xenophobia. Post-national citizenship. Chatterjee explores the concept of post-national citizenship, which challenges the idea of citizenship solely based on national boundaries. He advocates for an expanded notion of citizenship that embraces transnational affiliations and acknowledges the rights and identities of individuals beyond the confines of the nation-state. Nationalism and cultural hybridity. Chatterjee discusses the complexities of cultural hybridity within nationalist movements. He argues that nationalist ideologies often seek to define and preserve a supposedly pure national culture, overlooking the realities of cultural exchange, migration, and hybrid identities. Chatterjee highlights the need to recognize and value the diversity and fluidity of cultures within nationalist frameworks. Nationalism and social movements. Chatterjee examines the relationship between nationalism and social movements. He argues that nationalist movements can both support and co-opt broader social struggles for justice and equality. Chatterjee calls for a critical assessment of the ways in which nationalist ideologies interact with and impact grassroots movements for social change. Nationalism and global hegemony. Chatterjee explores the implications of nationalism within the context of global power dynamics. He argues that nationalist ideologies can be instrumentalized by dominant global powers to assert their hegemony and further their geopolitical interests. Chatterjee raises concerns about the potential for nationalist rhetoric to mask or legitimize forms of domination and imperialism. Nationalism and the politics of borders. Chatterjee engages with the politics of borders within nationalist movements. He examines how borders are constructed and contested, and how they shape notions of inclusion and exclusion. Chatterjee raises questions about the ethical dimensions of border politics and the need to reimagine more inclusive and just forms of territoriality. Decolonizing nationalism. Chatterjee calls for a decolonial approach to nationalism that challenges the legacies of colonialism and imperialism. He argues for an engagement with post-colonial theories and practices that seek to subvert dominant power structures and envision alternative futures beyond nationalist frameworks. Nationalism and ethnic conflict. Chatterjee explores the link between nationalism and ethnic conflict. He argues that nationalist ideologies can exacerbate tensions and conflicts between different ethnic or cultural groups within a nation. Chatterjee highlights the importance of addressing the root causes of ethnic conflict and promoting inclusive forms of nationalism that respect and accommodate diverse identities. Nationalism and colonial legacies. Chatterjee examines how nationalism interacts with the legacies of colonialism. He argues that nationalist movements often emerge in response to colonial oppression and seek to reclaim cultural and political autonomy. However, Chatterjee also critiques how nationalist discourses can inadvertently reproduce colonial power structures or perpetuate hierarchies inherited from the colonial era. Nationalism and historical injustices. Chatterjee discusses the role of nationalism in addressing or perpetuating historical injustices. He raises questions about how nationalist movements reckon with past injustices such as colonization, slavery, or genocide. Chatterjee emphasizes the need for critical engagement with history and the inclusion of marginalized narratives in the process of national reconciliation. Nationalism and political mobilization. Chatterjee analyzes the mobilizing power of nationalism in political movements. He examines how nationalist rhetoric and symbols can galvanize mass support and facilitate political organization. Chatterjee highlights the importance of critically assessing the motivations and agendas behind nationalist mobilization to ensure that it aligns with principles of justice and equality. Nationalism and neoliberalism. Chatterjee explores the relationship between nationalism and neoliberalism, a dominant economic ideology. He argues that nationalist movements can sometimes align with neoliberal policies that prioritize market forces and privatization, potentially marginalizing marginalized communities and exacerbating social inequalities. Chatterjee calls for a critical examination of the intersection of nationalism and neoliberalism to safeguard social justice. Nationalism and intellectual discourses. Chatterjee examines the role of intellectuals in shaping nationalist discourses. He analyzes how intellectuals contribute to the construction of national identities, ideologies, and narratives. Chatterjee raises questions about the responsibilities of intellectuals in promoting inclusive and ethical forms of nationalism and the potential dangers of uncritical nationalist narratives. Nationalism and territorial claims. Chatterjee discusses the politics of territorial claims within nationalist movements. He examines how nationalist ideologies can fuel conflicts over land, borders, and territorial sovereignty. Chatterjee emphasizes the importance of resolving such conflicts through dialogue, negotiation, and recognition of the rights and aspirations of all affected parties. Nationalism and cultural hegemony. Chatterjee engages with the notion of cultural hegemony within nationalist movements. He examines how dominant cultural groups can impose their values, language, and traditions on marginalized communities, suppressing their own cultural expressions and identities. Chatterjee advocates for a pluralistic and inclusive nationalism that respects and celebrates diverse cultural practices. Nationalism and indigenous rights. Chatterjee explores the relationship between nationalism and the rights of indigenous peoples. He argues for the recognition of indigenous rights within nationalist frameworks and the inclusion of indigenous perspectives in shaping national policies. Chatterjee emphasizes the need for nationalist movements to address historical injustices and respect the self-determination and cultural autonomy of indigenous communities. Nationalism and the environment. Chatterjee discusses the connection between nationalism and environmental issues. He raises concerns about the potential for nationalist agendas to prioritize economic development at the expense of ecological sustainability. Chatterjee advocates for an ecological nationalism that integrates environmental considerations and promotes responsible stewardship of natural resources. Nationalism and language politics. Chatterjee examines the role of language in nationalist movements. He argues that nationalist ideologies often prioritize a particular language as the marker of national identity, potentially marginalizing linguistic minorities. Chatterjee highlights the need for linguistic inclusivity and the recognition of multiple languages within nationalist frameworks. Nationalism and media manipulation. Chatterjee explores the influence of media in shaping nationalist discourses and public opinion. He raises concerns about the potential for media manipulation and propaganda in promoting exclusionary and divisive nationalist ideologies. Chatterjee emphasizes the importance of media literacy and critical engagement with media representations of nationalism. Nationalism and human rights. Chatterjee discusses the intersection of nationalism and human rights. He examines how nationalist movements can both promote and violate human rights, depending on their agendas and actions. Chatterjee advocates for a human rights-based approach to nationalism that upholds the principles of equality, dignity, and justice for all individuals. Nationalism and militarization. Chatterjee analyzes the link between nationalism and militarization. He raises concerns about the glorification of military power and the potential for nationalist movements to prioritize militaristic solutions to conflicts. Chatterjee calls for a demilitarization of nationalist ideologies and the exploration of nonviolent approaches to addressing grievances and disputes. Nationalism and social exclusion. Chatterjee examines the potential for social exclusion within nationalist movements. He argues that nationalist ideologies can create hierarchies based on factors such as race, caste, religion, or socioeconomic status, leading to the marginalization of certain groups. Chatterjee advocates for an inclusive nationalism that challenges social inequalities and promotes social justice. Nationalism and global capitalism. Chatterjee explores the relationship between nationalism and global capitalism. He argues that nationalist movements can be influenced by and entangled with the dynamics of global capitalism, leading to contradictions and tensions. Chatterjee calls for a critical analysis of how nationalist agendas intersect with economic systems and the potential for alternative forms of economic organization. Nationalism and historical revisionism. Chatterjee discusses the phenomenon of historical revisionism within nationalist movements. He raises concerns about the distortion or manipulation of historical narratives to suit nationalist ideologies or political agendas. Chatterjee emphasizes the importance of rigorous historical scholarship and the recognition of diverse perspectives in understanding the complexities of national histories. Nationalism and technology. Chatterjee examines the role of technology in shaping nationalist movements. He explores how digital platforms and social media can facilitate the spread of nationalist ideologies and the mobilization of supporters. Chatterjee raises questions about the ethical implications of technology in nationalist discourses and the need for critical engagement with digital spaces. Nationalism and political authoritarianism. Chatterjee analyzes the potential for nationalist movements to veer towards political authoritarianism. He raises concerns about the concentration of power, erosion of democratic principles, and suppression of dissent within nationalist regimes. Chatterjee emphasizes the importance of maintaining democratic institutions and checks and balances within nationalist frameworks. Nationalism and international relations. Chatterjee discusses the impact of nationalism on international relations. He explores how nationalist ideologies can shape foreign policies, diplomatic relations, and global cooperation. Chatterjee raises questions about the tensions between national interests and broader global challenges, advocating for a nuanced approach to international relations that balances national aspirations with collective goals. Partha. Chatterjee's critique of nationalism offers a comprehensive and nuanced examination of the complexities and implications of nationalist ideologies. Through his analysis, Chatterjee highlights the limitations, exclusions, and potential dangers associated with nationalist movements, while also acknowledging the historical and socio-political contexts in which they emerge. His critique encourages a critical engagement with nationalist discourses and calls for the exploration of alternative forms of political organization and affiliation. One of the key points in Chatterjee's critique is the examination of the relationship between nationalism and various social, political, and economic issues. He argues that nationalism can often exacerbate or neglect economic inequality, gender disparities, ethnic conflicts, and historical injustices. Chatterjee emphasizes the need to address these issues within nationalist frameworks to ensure social justice, inclusivity, and equality. Chatterjee also raises concerns about the potential for exclusionary practices within nationalist movements. He highlights how nationalist ideologies can marginalize linguistic, religious, and cultural minorities, perpetuate social hierarchies, and suppress dissent. This critique calls for an inclusive nationalism that values diversity, promotes social cohesion, and respects the rights and identities of marginalized groups. Furthermore, Chatterjee's analysis explores the interplay between nationalism and various external factors. He discusses how nationalist movements interact with colonial legacies, global capitalism, media manipulation, and technology. Chatterjee raises questions about the potential for nationalist ideologies to be co-opted by dominant global powers or to reinforce authoritarianism. His analysis underscores the importance of critically assessing the influence of these factors on nationalist discourses and their implications for democracy, human rights, and global cooperation. Throughout his critique, Chatterjee advocates for alternative visions and futures beyond narrow nationalist frameworks. He calls for a reimagining of collective identities and loyalties that move beyond exclusive national boundaries. Chatterjee emphasizes the need to engage with post-colonial theories, feminist perspectives, and ecological considerations to challenge dominant power structures, promote social justice, and envision more inclusive forms of political organization. Overall, Chatterjee's critique of nationalism offers a robust and multidimensional analysis of its complexities and implications. His work invites scholars, activists, and policymakers to critically engage with nationalist ideologies, recognize their potential pitfalls, and explore alternative frameworks that prioritize inclusivity, justice, and equality. By delving into various aspects of nationalism, Chatterjee's critique provides valuable insights for understanding and navigating the challenges and possibilities of nationalist movements in a rapidly changing world. Nationalism can be problematic for several reasons, as highlighted by Partha Chatterjee in his critique. Here are some key reasons why nationalism can be seen as a problem. Exclusion and marginalization. Nationalism often relies on the creation of a collective national identity based on certain characteristics, such as ethnicity, language, or culture. This can lead to the exclusion and marginalization of individuals or groups who do not fit within the dominant narrative of the nation. Nationalist ideologies may reinforce social hierarchies and perpetuate discrimination against minorities or marginalized communities. Ethnocentrism and xenophobia. Nationalism can foster ethnocentric attitudes, where one's own ethnic or national group is perceived as superior to others. This can lead to xenophobia and the demonization of foreigners or those who are perceived as other. Nationalist ideologies that promote a sense of superiority can fuel prejudice, discrimination, and even hostility towards individuals or groups considered outside the nation. Conflict and violence. Nationalism can contribute to conflict and violence, particularly when it is accompanied by exclusionary or aggressive policies. Nationalist movements may seek to assert territorial claims, engage in ethnic or religious conflicts, or promote militarization as a means to protect or advance the interests of the nation. Such conflicts can have devastating humanitarian consequences and undermine peace and stability. Suppression of dissent and authoritarianism. Nationalism can be used to suppress dissent and curtail individual freedoms. Nationalist regimes may restrict freedom of speech, assembly, and the press, particularly for those who criticize or challenge the dominant nationalist narrative. This can lead to the erosion of democratic values and the consolidation of authoritarian power. Historical revisionism and distorted narratives. Nationalism often relies on historical narratives that shape the collective memory and identity of a nation. However, these narratives can be subject to manipulation, distortion, or exclusion of certain historical events or perspectives. This can lead to a skewed understanding of the past and perpetuate injustices or misinterpretations that hinder reconciliation or perpetuate conflicts. Global implications. Nationalism can have implications beyond national borders. It can foster animosity and tensions between nations, hindering international cooperation and diplomacy. Nationalist ideologies that prioritize national interests over global challenges like climate change, human rights, or migration can impede collective efforts to address pressing global issues. Hindrance to cosmopolitanism and solidarity. Nationalism often emphasizes loyalty and attachment to one's own nation, potentially overshadowing or undermining a sense of global solidarity and interconnectedness. It can hinder efforts to build inclusive societies that embrace diversity, promote cosmopolitan values, and address shared global challenges collectively. Divisiveness and social fragmentation. Nationalism can create divisions within societies by emphasizing differences and fostering an us versus them mentality. It can lead to social fragmentation, where individuals or groups within a nation are pitted against each other based on perceived differences, such as ethnicity, religion, or regional identities. This can hinder social cohesion and impede efforts to build inclusive and harmonious societies. Inequality and injustice. Nationalism can exacerbate existing inequalities and injustices within societies. It may prioritize the interests of dominant groups or regions while neglecting the needs and aspirations of marginalized communities. Economic disparities, unequal distribution of resources, and exclusionary policies can be perpetuated or reinforced under nationalist frameworks, further widening social divides. Hindrance to global cooperation. Nationalism's focus on national interests can hinder international cooperation and collaboration. It may discourage nations from engaging in multilateral efforts or global initiatives that require collective action. This can impede progress on global challenges such as climate change, poverty, or pandemics, which require coordinated efforts beyond national borders. Cultural homogenization and loss of diversity. Nationalism's emphasis on a singular national identity can lead to the suppression or marginalization of diverse cultures, languages, and traditions within a nation. It can contribute to cultural homogenization, where unique cultural expressions and identities are subsumed under a dominant national culture. This loss of diversity can impoverish societies and limit the richness of human experiences. Economic protectionism. Nationalist ideologies sometimes advocate for protectionist economic policies, such as trade barriers or restrictions on immigration. While intended to safeguard domestic industries and jobs, such policies can hinder economic growth, innovation, and global cooperation. They can also perpetuate inequalities and hinder opportunities for economic development and prosperity. Propagation of national myths and stereotypes. Nationalism often relies on the creation and perpetuation of national myths, symbols, and stereotypes. These simplified narratives and images can oversimplify complex historical realities and perpetuate biases and prejudices. They can reinforce stereotypes about other nations or cultures, fostering misunderstanding, mistrust, and animosity. Environmental consequences. Nationalism can overlook or downplay environmental concerns in pursuit of national interests. Policies driven by nationalist ideologies may prioritize economic growth or resource extraction at the expense of ecological sustainability. This can have detrimental consequences for the environment, including deforestation, pollution, and the degradation of natural habitats. Potential for manipulation and authoritarianism. Nationalism can be exploited for political gain or manipulated by authoritarian leaders. Nationalist rhetoric and symbols can be used to consolidate power, suppress opposition, and erode democratic institutions. The potential for nationalist movements to devolve into authoritarian regimes poses a threat to individual freedoms, human rights, and democratic governance. These additional points highlight the potential problems associated with nationalism, including its divisive nature, impact on social justice and equality, hindrance to global cooperation, cultural homogenization, economic protectionism, propagation of stereotypes, environmental consequences, and susceptibility to manipulation and authoritarianism. They underline the importance of critically evaluating nationalist ideologies and advocating for inclusive and just approaches to governance and identity formation.